speaking from Solarplaza in Rotterdam. I hope everybody is fine, that you're not suffering right now by any consequences of the COVID. This is really like a very strange period for all of us in the whole world. So thanks to take your time for attending this webinar today. And our intent today is to actually give you a bit of latest information and perspective on the Portuguese PV market in these uncertain times. There are tenders going on, but how is business going? What will happen in the next few weeks? I guess all of you coming here today are wondering about the expert opinion of IHS Market, Josefin Berg. We'll tell you a bit more about that in a few minutes. So again, welcome on board. I'm Thomas Bonicel from Solarplaza. I'll be entertaining you for the next, let's say, 5 to 7 minutes with the introduction. Then I will give the floor to Josephine from IHS Market, who's got a very nice presentation and very good insights on her vision on what's going to happen in Portugal in the next few months and years. And at the end of the session, we will have time together for question and answers. We'll see exactly how long this session will be, but expect something between like 45 and 60 minutes. Continuing, so Solarplaza, in case you're not very familiar with us, we're a Dutch company. We are based in Rotterdam, and we are getting a bit older than 15 years now. We've got a mission, which is to impact the world positively by doing everything we can to accelerate sustainable energy transition. And how do we do that? We do that by organizing events, trade missions, webinars like today. We are also now getting into purely virtual events. As you can see on your screen, we've already done so far 140 physical events. But a couple of weeks ago, we've done our first major virtual event called Solarplaza Europe. I can already tell you we'll have a few more things like this in the pipe in the coming months and years. We've done events covering more than 40 countries, and we're known also for our networks of PV professionals. We've got more than 60,000 people in our network. And again, we're there to really promote and push solar energy, and let's be fair, more globally speaking, renewables. Continuing, so events. Again, we all recognize it's a bit of a strange period. In many countries, physical events are even like very, very restricted right now. I just wanted to put here, like on this slide, a few examples of things we're still doing our best to do for real physical events for markets that should be interesting for you if you're interested in Portugal. So I'll just go quickly through those four. You can find all our list of coming events on solarplaza.com. It's easier there. We have events also in Greece, in the US, in Australia. We have a number of things planned. But again, if you're interested in Portugal, you may be interested in Scandinavia, and we're doing an event in Stockholm on September 23rd. You may be interested in Italy, and we're doing an event there in Milan on October 1st. You may be interested in France, and we're doing something in Paris on October 6th. And we also think you may be interested in Spain, and we're doing something there on December 1st. Now, let's focus a bit on Portugal. This webinar that you're going to, that you're attending, but like where the main message is coming a bit later, this is to actually keep on promoting our event, our second event in Portugal, Solar Market Parity Portugal. We are doing, again, all our best to make it happen physically, really at the venue at the Intercontinental Lisbon on September 15th, 2020. You can see here like the website, portugal.solarmarketparity.com. All the latest info are there. We have a very nice program, which is 90% ready. We have more than 15 speakers already confirmed, including the Vice Minister, Mr. Galamba, our partner Aprens CEO, Pedro Amaral will be speaking also in there. And we have like people from EDP, Finogreen, Sungrow, Econ Consulting, etc., who will be taking the stage. So I would really invite you to check the website, and actually, if you're interested in joining, buy your ticket before the end of tomorrow, because we have our early bird pricing campaign finishing tomorrow evening. We'll get back again to it at the end of this presentation. But again, yeah, we have this lowest price campaign running until tomorrow evening. And again, at this event, our plan is to connect all of you already playing in the Portuguese market or interested in playing on that market. We are planning to have 120 to 150 people attending the event. We already have more than 10 sponsors and partners for the event. And with all our latest technologies, we'll be able to give you like really nice content and also really cool ways to do network, quickly reconnect with your current business partners and find new ones. And then actually, before we move to the presentation, I have a quick poll for you. Again, we know it's a very uncertain time. We know that some of you are allowed to travel by their company, but some of you may not. You may also, like maybe just because of personal choices, prefer to not travel. So we have a quick poll coming to actually just see what your view is on traveling to Lisbon. If you can, like, please take a few minutes, well, a few seconds actually, and just like give us your opinion. We have 4 different possibilities to answer. Either you live in Portugal and you're very fine to attend an event in Lisbon, or you live in Portugal, but for many different reasons, you are not wanting to attend any public event, or you live abroad, you would have to fly to Lisbon and it's no problem for you, you're interested to attend an event in Lisbon, or finally, you live abroad, but no, you, for a number of different reasons, you're not interested to fly. So if you could just please take a few more seconds. Let's see what kind of answers we are getting. Yes, thanks for answering. So like majority of our audience today is located in Portugal, and most of you are still interested in attending. And for international non-Portuguese people, it's even. Thanks, that's really helping us to see like how we keep on progressing and organizing our event. So thanks for that. Some practical notes now for our webinar. If you have questions, technical issues, you can use the chat box, which you should see on the side with that little question mark. You can, and you should actually, send us all your questions during the presentation. Me and my partner Marco will be able to just like see them, moderate them, and just like handle them at the end of the meeting. So it's really, again, send us your questions during the webinar, and we'll handle them at the end of the session during the Q&A session. Slides are available in the handout section, and don't worry, you don't have to take notes. The recordings will be available afterwards. Josephine's presentation will be sent to you by email. Well, it's weekend coming, so you should have them latest like Monday in the afternoon. Hopefully earlier than that, but you can count on Solarplaza. You will get the PDF from Josephine in your mailbox at the latest by Monday. With all that said, practical notes, let me now introduce Josephine. Okay, my slide was slow to appear. So Josephine from IHS Market will be like giving you all our latest insights and vision on this market. Josephine is holding a Master of Science in Environmental Engineering from the Swedish University of Uppsala. She began her career at the European Space Agency and then in the consulting firm Bax & Willems. And she's been working for IHS Market for already 10 years, being currently their research and analysis manager. Josephine will give you the floor, but before that, we will pass you a poll. Josephine has a poll for the audience to get an exact feel of like who you are, what kind of background you are. So here we go for the second poll. Please spend a few seconds filling that for Josephine so she's got a better feel of which background you are from. Are you a technology or service supplier already doing business in Portugal? Or a technology or service supplier not yet involved but interested in doing PV business in Portugal? Or are you an investor or developer already involved in PV business in Portugal? Or, answer number 4, soon going to be involved? Or other? Let's run that for a few more seconds. And then we will give the floor to Josephine. So we have a majority today of investors and developers already doing business in Portugal. and 55% of our audience already doing business in Portugal. Interesting. Josephine, I hope this will help you to get a bit more of a feel of who you're addressing today. And then we will give you the controls, and the floor is yours.
Hello, Thomas. Hello, everyone listening. Really interesting to see that. Yeah, we have a lot of we have a big audience, and we have a big audience also of people. Well, kind of a bit more than half already doing business in Portugal, and the rest still kind of looking at the market. So what I'm going to do here today, I mean, Thomas already mentioned it. I'm going to talk to you about the Portuguese PV market. It's going to be more of a teaser, of course, for the solar market parity event that they're organizing in September. And you know, I'll try to avoid saying things that most of you might already know. But there are a lot of aspects to cover, I think, in the Portuguese market. So we'll see what we'll get through in the coming half hour. So first about IHS Market. I think most of you are familiar with our company. We are a major research firm looking at providing intelligence across the main business areas across different industries, from conventional energy, automotive, chemicals. We look at country risk, economic analysis, and within this group we have our clean technology and renewables team, which has been specifically very focused on solar PV for the past 10-15 years, and we've now grown our business to be looking at PV from various countries across the world, so we're able to capture both the local events and also to cover this whole supply chain, so from polysilicon production to the end user and the investors in solar power. And we provide this intelligence to our clients. I also saw that there are some of our clients that have logged into this webinar today, and I also want to give a heads up to you that we will also provide you with an even more detailed profile on the Portuguese market very soon as part of the research for our clients. So what do you need to know about Portugal? Well, here are the main facts from today. If we look at COVID, we had some delays of the tenders. We will expect some challenges in the commercial PV segment, but overall Portugal has been kind of shielded from some of the major effects from COVID-19. But we did still revise down our forecast for Portugal in our last updates, just to take into account the delays that have still taken place this year. Of course, as you know, it's a tender market. The tenders are very interesting. Now we have the submission deadline coming up for the next 700 megawatt tender. There's a 50 megawatt EPC tender open that was opened at the end of 2019. Portugal has raised their targets, so it's now looking for 9 gigawatt of PV by 2030, which really creates a lot of potential for Portugal, which has been traditionally a small market in the European context. And what we expect from IHS Market is that Portugal will install about 4 gigawatts from now to 2024, and most of that will be in utility scale plants. And that will happen both through these tenders that we see, but also through private PPAs. And of course, how the tenders work in Portugal, some of the tender projects are also working with PPAs. So there's also a hybrid version there. And then on the rooftop, on commercial residential side of things, we see a lot of potential for both self-consumption and also under the small producer scheme that has been simplified over the past year. And of course, to highlight, and what we'll talk about later in the presentation, is also that in the tender in 2019, we got bid tariffs as low as 15 euro per megawatt hour, which was a world record at the time, and maybe people wouldn't have expected a world record to come from Portugal of all markets. When this is something, the records have usually been in the Middle East and some of the Latin American tenders. I think that surprised a lot of people, maybe except for Aku Energy who provided the bid. And we'll discuss that a bit further on. So we'll talk about COVID-19 first, because I think that's really what's where the big uncertainty is right now all across the world. There's still no final answers, of course. And then we look at the drivers of PV in Portugal, looking at the targets and the rules. And then we'll look at what will happen to rooftop PV, and then on the utility scale PV market, what we can expect there. So COVID-19 here, it's really the example of where something that seemed very small and localized in January has had an enormous disrupting effect across the world and through all businesses and how we live our lives. If we look at some of the numbers here, I mean, we're now at more than 11 million cases in these confirmed cases. Last time I checked, we had a drop in commercial flights of 74%. I mean, now it's picking up a little bit now as the restrictions are easing, but I think a lot of this was definitely noticeable, both in just how traveling took place, and also in pollution levels, noise levels. This drop in flights is also one of the big impacts. We expect now, or our economists expect, that the global GDP will decline by 5.5% in 2020, and after having been up 2.6% in 2019. And what the impact will be on the PV market, we still don't know the final number, of course, for 2020 and what the exact impact is going to be. What we do know is that this first half of the year started with supply being curtailed because of the lockdown in China. As a lot of the production exports were halted, there was a very big supply constraint. And once China started coming back and manufacturing and exporting, we had the rest of the world closing down, and we had this collapse in global energy demand, and global business had a halt to a lot of PV projects and their construction. And now we're in this phase where we've seen in many markets where we're kind of reactivating the economy. But as we've seen, this is highly local in the direct impact. I mean, it's very specific to which country, even which region you are in, which country. We still don't know exactly what's going to happen to the virus over the next months, how it's going to spread, if it's going to be contained. There's still a lot of uncertainties here. And in terms of PV installations, some markets haven't really noticed anything at all. We've seen utility scale PV in the US, for example, go on more or less undisrupted, whereas you have a country like India, where everything has been kind of shut down, first because of the supply restrictions from China, and then because of the lockdown of the country and the difficulty to get workers back to the sites. So it's very specific in each country what the impact has been here on the PV market if you're looking at 2020 installations. So we had we had some of the impacts that we've seen are, like I said, the supply shortage that we had in the first quarter of the year. There have been restrictions in how you can construct, depending on the degree of lockdown you had in different countries. We've seen migrant workforce, for example, also leaving. Especially in India, this was a very big movement of migrant workforce moving back to their home states because of the lockdown. Other markets have had maybe less of an impact, but still difficulty sometimes to get workforce back immediately to restart construction. And for future developments, we see a lot of the administrative delays as being, they've been hindering, for example, tender processes from going on. So the Portuguese tender was delayed several months. Also getting permits, doing necessary site visits for development, that's been kind of put on hold. Not being able to travel has really, hindered some of the international investors, especially in emerging markets. We'll see now what happens to financing for projects over the next year, how much financing will actually be available for PV, what will happen to things like the European Rescue Package and the Green Deal, and exchange rates and how they will affect the costs for PV projects. And then the big uncertainty on electricity prices, which has also shaken some of those looking to sign PPAs and build unsubsidized PV plants, because the models for electricity price forecast have changed due to this drop in demand that we've seen over the past months. So for the longer outlook for PV after COVID-19, if we really can say that there's a post COVID-19, we have on one hand we have the low oil prices and low prices for oil has created an even greater interest among oil companies to change their business to more renewables, which I think is positive for the PV sector, that that renewables is starting to be seen as a higher value business. We've seen a quick shift here in terms of digitalization. I think it's something that we've all experienced through virtual working, but it also means that more digitalization of the actual assets, like doing remote O&M, etc., is becoming more popular. We are seeing also more interest here in securing local supply of energy, both at a country level, where countries are now becoming, more aware of trying to be independent in some ways from global dynamics, but even at our household level, you can see in some markets more increase in interest for PV and kind of PV and storage, and try to get some kind of independence from global events, and by producing and storing your own electricity. So we see some indications there as well of decentralized power to become more popular in the future. And then what really will happen with this green recovery and that everyone's talking about right now, that recovery and stimulus funds should go through some kind of green filter, and that's hopefully that will bring more money and investments also into the solar PV sector. See here. So on the impact that we've seen here on the PV markets is, this is how we've changed our forecast on our latest forecast compared to pre-COVID-19. our 2020 numbers. So we lowered all markets basically except for China, which we saw recovering, after that first initial shock. We see a lot of good activity, or a lot of activity picking up in China. But for the rest of the world, we've lowered the forecast. And we mainly have India being one of the lowest countries, or that we had to cut by more than half. But we've also done some revisions upward. Our first cut for the 2020 numbers was very rough, just across the board, because we thought, okay, everything's locked down, we need to cut 2020 just generally. And now we've raised a lot of countries. Like, we don't see as big of an impact on the United States. United States, it's mainly, so far. So what we've seen so far this year, things are still developing there with the virus outbreak. But we didn't see much impact on utility scale PV, but mainly on the residential and commercial segments. So the US, for example, hasn't come down. It's been revised upwards. Let's say it that way. And for the overall 2020 numbers now, we're about 117 gigawatt for 2020, which means that this year will be the first year where we'll have a decline in PV installations from year to year. But then we expect the curve to come back. Let's see, here's the slide. We see the curve then to come back, and then we'll have continued growth over the next years. So Portugal still been less impacted compared to a lot of other countries in the world, a lot of other countries in Europe, but we do see an economic downturn also here. Big impact, of course, is the tourism industry that is suffering. And there's still a risk of a second wave in Portugal. We had some neighborhoods in Lisbon that returned to lockdown in early July. And so this is monitored very closely across the country to make sure that there is no second wave, and that there will only be if there are localized outbreaks, then that will be contained. And in May, the state of emergency ended, so we've seen a gradual relaxation of restriction, and this mainly applies to small businesses, but also life is supposed to come back to more or less normal if everything's go well. There was a large aid package that was established to help limit the downturn, but this will also lead to a widening of the fiscal deficit this year, and I think that's what's going to happen across a lot of markets, where we'll see more deficits. But that's not really the priority for governments this year. And the Prime Minister of Portugal, he has said that he thinks the recovery will take at least 2-3 years. So that's where we put Portugal kind of on the COVID, on the COVID-19 map, and how things have been developing. In terms of PV, the construction of solar parks didn't seem to be that much impacted of the projects that were still ongoing. The tender, of course, has been postponed, so we now have the deadline for the end of July. We also had a suspension of the licensing deadlines that had been put in place for the projects that were awarded in 2019. So that gives a bit of a breathing space for those projects, for those developers that needed to meet with different deadlines in order to keep their projects. And in order to boost a bit the smaller segment, there was also a fast tracking on the grid connection process for 30 megawatt of projects up to 1 megawatt. And then I want to talk about the impact on, just mention also the impact on power prices in the Iberia power market, because there has been definitely this Sunday all week power demand that we've seen under the lockdowns has been, has made power prices come down, but it's not the only reason that we see for why we see low power prices in the Iberian market. Because if you look here, you can see that the wholesale power prices, they've been going downward steadily, more or less, for the past year. And this is very closely linked to gas prices because the market is closely determined by gas generation. And so this changes, some of the models and what the outlook that you have for PV and capture prices for unsubsidized PV. And one of the main assumptions that we've seen people has been that power prices steadily over 40-50 euro per megawatt hour, which would make PV pretty profitable over the lifetime of a project. And our pre-COVID-19 assumptions, we had capture prices for PV come up to close to 50 euro in the coming years, but we're now when we're revising our model because of COVID-19, we're now not even getting up to 40 euro in the coming years. So it's not an easy case to do unsubsidized PV. This unsubsidized PV and relying on market prices in the Iberian market, well, I think in every market, it really depends on the individual conditions for each PV project, for each developer, and it has to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. We're not in an easy feed-in tariff market anymore, and forecasting power prices, it's becoming increasingly important. And we'll come back to talking about these power prices also when talking about more about the tender process. So why would you do PV in Portugal? Portugal ranks 17th among the European PV markets if you look at total installed PV capacity. So what we can say from this is that there's still a huge potential for Portugal as a PV market. It's definitely not saturated. We saw that there's the 9 gigawatt targets. It's still a lot to be done in Portugal to install more PV plants. And Portugal already set the record, for PV tender tariffs. And I want to mention this up front because I think it's like one of the parts of big interest for everyone. Like, how could Portugal be lower than Saudi Arabia in a tender? I mean, what is important here is that all tenders are different and have different conditions, different assumptions. And in Portugal, there are a couple of things I see a couple of things missing here some points missing, but you can see the countries here where you have the different levels of the tenders. There should be some dots next to them as well. But anyway, Portugal at 14.76 euros per megawatt hour. This is under 15-year PPA. So to get to that level, you have to count also on the value of the power after those 15 years. So it's also betting on that power prices will be high enough after those 15 years so that you'll get more profit at the end of the project lifetime. We can also talk about economies of scale. Aku Energy, who did this, did this bid, they also had other projects with they were also awarded other projects with higher prices. So also by developing a lot of PV projects, they can get the scale of their projects and even out the profits also. And you should think of the value that's considered, the value of the grid connection in Portugal, because the grid connections are so scarce that you can expect that this grid connection will maintain its value also at the end of the project lifetime, or at the end of the PV project lifetime. And by having this secure this grid connection, you might also, you're sure that you're on the market and can capture the right prices even after your 15 years under this lower price. So this is a bit cryptic slide here. Just want to point out three things. Also, why PV is interesting in Portugal. First of all, the 21% refers to the high capacity factor that we see, especially in regions like Algarve and Anteillo. You have 21% capacity factor is what we've seen on projects installed so far in these regions. So that makes Portugal a very interesting region in Europe. If you compare to countries like Germany, where it can be around 13%, we're really talking about good generation here. The sixth, it refers to the high retail power prices in Portugal. So Portugal has the sixth highest retail power prices in Europe, which makes self-consumption a very, very interesting segment for both households and small businesses. And the 9 gigawatts refers to the targets. So we have the targets for 2030, which given the low deployment of PV so far, creates a very big opportunity to install PV in Portugal. Just going to go quickly through the strategies and plans that are in place to reach these targets. So we had the plan, the National Energy Strategy up to 2020, and the different iterations of that plan. Now in May, they approved the PNEC, so the new National Energy and Climate Plan that will lead to 2030, which then replaces the previous plans. The PNEC, as I've mentioned, they have this target of 9 gigawatt of PV installed by 2030, of which 2 gigawatts should be decentralized PV and 7 gigawatts should be in centralized, so large-scale PV plants. So this is the trajectory that they foresee over the coming years. And how Portugal will achieve these targets. If we look at the smaller segment first, we already have a legislation for self-consumption. It's called the UPAC, the Unidad de Producción de Autoconsumo. I just pronounced it in Spanish because that's where I'm based. Sorry for that. But the self-consumption systems. You have the small production units, the UPPs, which have now also been changed, or the scheme has been changed to simplify the licensing of these projects. There's a market regime in place, which means that you can sell on the PV power on the private market. So this is what we've seen in unsubsidized plants that have been installed over the past years. And now since 2019, you have this tender process. And this is what the Portuguese PV market has looked like over the past 10 years under all these regimes. So first there was a feed-in tariff, and then they removed that feed-in tariff scheme because of grid connection issues or grid capacity issues. And I think the grid has really been the common thread through everything that's been done until now in Portugal, especially for large scale PV, because you weren't able to reserve grid connection points previously. So you would need to develop your project and then try to get the grid access. And you might have had a project that was fully developed, and then you didn't have the capacity available anymore at the point where you needed. And this even led to this situation that in 2018 there was a lottery to decide on who would get grid connection capacities. And it's kind of a really extreme situation, showing how much demand there was and how difficult it was to distribute these grid connection points. so those who weren't successful in that draw to get their grid access, I mean, they know that they would have to wait with their projects until the grid has been further developed, so 2021 or later. There are big plans of expanding the grid and reinforcing the grid in Portugal, but of course that will take time. And this meant that in 2019, after you had some projects that had been installed and that had been successfully getting grid connection points, in 2019 they decided on the auctions. On the auction. So here, so before going back to the auction, let's again go back to then let's first look at the self-consumption and the small production schemes. So to date, 420 megawatt of small-scale PV installations have been installed. We have 170 megawatt in the micro mini scheme, which doesn't exist any longer, and the rest are in the self-consumption and small producer scheme. But we've seen very little additions in 2020. And I think either there's a lag here in terms of registrations, or it really shows the impact also of COVID-19 on the smaller scale segment. So how do these segments work? So you have the UPAC, so the production for self-consumption. Here you can choose between doing 100% self-consumption or do partial self-consumption and sell electricity to the grid. And you now until up to 30 kilowatt systems do not need any inspection, but have a kind of simplified process to be installed. Whereas above 30 kilowatt to 1 megawatt, you need to register the system, and you also need to have an inspection of the system before it can start to operate. Anything above 1 megawatt would require a production license. The small production unit is for selling electricity to the grid. Of now, it's for systems up to 1 megawatt as of last year. And this small production scheme has also been simplified in order to have less bureaucracy involved. But like I said, we have seen very little growth so far in these segments during this year. So we will see how this develops now in the coming years, because the simplification should mean that we should see more installations in the segment just below 1 megawatt. And here's a bit of the summary of what you're allowed to do for self-consumption and consumption according to the latest law. But we're not going to dwell on that. But we go back to the large installations because I think this is where things are happening right now. We've had over the past years a lot of announcements of PPAs. PPA projects, unsubsidized projects in Portugal. We also had a couple of large projects installed, and it's kind of piecing, getting these pieces here. I mean, it's definitely not as much happening compared to what we've seen in Spain, but we see specific developers moving forward with projects, and of course it is also related to if they're securing the grid access for these projects. So what happened until 2019 then was that there had been more than 1.2 gigawatt of PV projects had been licensed to sell energy under the market regime, but still less than 300 megawatt had been installed by that time. And that is one of the reasons why the government decided to take control of this grid connection and the grid allocation by announcing the auctions. So first the auction was held in July last year, and now the one that's or in June last year, and the one that's taking place this July with the results that we will see in August. So moving to the auction was a way of getting some control and getting the whole grid issue back in order. So in June 2019, they published more specifications of what you can do with your production licenses, how generation should work, and that in order to get grid capacity injection rights, you could now go through these auctions. And if you have a license but you don't have the grid capacity, your license is suspended until you get the grid access. So that's kind of slowed or made the market a bit more realistic, I would say. So after this, now you can do to get grid injection rights. You can go through bilateral contracts. You can go directly and negotiate with a grid company, or you can go through the auction scheme. So the auctions that we've had the one last year with in total 1.3 gigawatt AC awarded. First there was 1,150 megawatts awarded, and then there was one lot which only had one bidder, so they awarded those 142 megawatts later. And now this year the plan is that to award 700 megawatts, and we will see if the end of this year we'll get to the next auction of 500 megawatts, or if there'll be more delays. So last year's auction had two, it is a very peculiar auction. I just want to say, I mean, it's not like any other auction. I think, well, every auction in every country is different, right? There are different specifications, different criteria. But in Portugal, it was really focused around these lots where you had grid connection. So it's about getting the grid access, and you could choose to bid either on a guaranteed remuneration. So that would work like a contract for difference for 15 years, or you could bid for the general remuneration, which means that you would get the grid access, you'd sell your power at the wholesale market or through a PPA, and then you pay the grid operator for your rights. And anyone could choose between these two systems. There are lots of documents out there explaining the technical details of how this works and how projects were then compared with each other. But overall, it was a heavily oversubscribed auction. We had more than 10 gigawatts of applications for it was supposed to be 1.4 gigawatt auction. There was one lot that was never that didn't get any bidders. So at the end, we ended up with this 1.3 gigawatts. And this year, well, if we look, I just want to mention also the results, but I think you've all seen the results. I don't think that should be anything new for you. Most companies got their projects through guaranteed remuneration, with three companies that are looking at the general remuneration. So really expecting market power prices to be good, or that they will be able to sign profitable PPAs. So the difference here is really between in the guaranteed remuneration, it's kind of the developer takes less risk, but in the general remuneration, the developer takes more risk, but it can also get higher benefits depending on how power prices develop. And yeah, to the right you see the different lots. So there are 24 lots, and the prices varied greatly depending on the lot. So everyone's talking about this 14.76, but you have for some lots you got up to 31 euros. So there's a very big gap there in between the different lots and the power prices or the PPA prices that they bid for. Now this year, what's happening? So we're looking at 700 megawatt to be auctioned, again in different lots, different lots with different grid capacity available. Just like previously, you have the guaranteed remuneration, so or like a fixed remuneration. You then have the general remuneration, so the wholesale market, or you sign a private PPA, and then they've added a storage piece, which is where you can get a capacity payment for storage. And they're adding this also to start looking at what's the value of storage. Can we integrate storage with the grid already now? How can that help us to build out the grid? And the auction is really designed there to look at the value for the grid, the value for the grid operator, the value for the whole system, to get the cheapest types of power in the most stable environment as possible. And there are a lot of specifics here in the design to help the development of the grid in Portugal. So that's about the big tender now. We get a lot of questions about floating solar. Of course, Portugal has a lot of dams, has a lot of hydropower, with dams where it could be very beneficial to install floating solar, both for the power generated and also for covering the dams and to avoid the evaporation from the dams. We'll see now what will happen with the tender that was launched by the EDIA that manages the Alquiva dam. So they've planned 10 projects up to 50 megawatt installed, and I think that will be the kind of a pilot project on a larger scale, where we'll see if this will work and if other dams in Portugal will start looking more at incorporating floating solar. But it's definitely something that has a lot of potential in Portugal, and I think in all markets with a great share of hydro. We did our floating solar report in March this year, and we started seeing increasing interest in Europe, although we do believe that most of the floating solar that will happen in Asia over the coming 5 years. But it's also, we're very optimistic. We see expect about 10 gigawatts of floating solar to be installed over the next 5 years across the world. So a couple of maybe there will be a couple of 100 megawatts in Portugal, but on a global scale it might not be that visible, but it would definitely be significant in the country. And with these private PPAs, with the auctions, with floating solar, we track, if looking at the utility scale segment, we track at least 53 projects that are planned. There are various stages of development. So that's about a 3 gigawatt PV pipeline for Portugal. And the sizes of these projects, it's mainly in the range of 10 to 20 megawatt, 20 to 50 megawatt. That's where we see the most projects. A couple of projects then in the 100, 200 megawatt range. And so far we have one or two projects that are larger than 200 megawatt. So we will probably see more of these smaller. It feels weird to call a 20 megawatt plant small, but that's how it is. That's how it is nowadays, because these smaller projects will have it easier regarding land, which isn't combined with the grid. Land use is also a very big issue in Portugal. But that's the kind of projects that we see. If we're looking at the companies that are involved in these projects, I mean, 2/3 of this capacity, 2/3 of these 3 gigawatt belong to 10 large developers. This includes the projects that were installed last year. So if you look at the projects installed last year, we have 10 developers that kind of dominate the Portuguese market so far. You have also the Ireland-based WeLink. They already completed 266 megawatts. I think everyone knows about those projects. Other major companies that are involved are Iberdrola, EDPR, and Total. And then you have all the all the other other tender winners. And then just to mention the EPCs before we wrap up here is that we mainly see Portuguese EPCs so far involved in the market, except for CTIEC then that was working with WeLink on their projects. But we had FASEC, Voltalia, Jaime de Costa. Well, Voltalia, I mean, it's French, but it acquired Martifer, the Portuguese company before. So let's see if we're going to get more EPC companies in the market now as it grows. And with that, I think we can end here. I see we're getting close to the hour. So let's see if you want to take in some questions. Here's
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Like, thanks a lot, Josephine. And yes, indeed, we got a number of questions. We just have 3 minutes, so like I'll pass a few quick messages to our audience. First, like, thanks again, Josephine. Like, really nice deck. A question which came a few times. Don't worry, everybody who's been listening. Even if you missed the beginning, the deck that Josephine has shown you will be shared with all of you in your mailbox no later than Monday afternoon. So no worry, you will get that. There were a few very good questions on floating, but actually Josephine really touched upon them on like the tender. Josephine mentioned also that IHS has published lately a report on floating. So I would invite you actually to just get in touch directly with Josephine. You should see her email right now here, josephine.berg@ihsmarket.com. I'm pretty sure she will be able to help you out with that. I'm just rushing it to be able to still quickly take. I'll merge a few questions together. And again, like there's a few questions that came in there where Josephine has really addressed it in the very last minute. But Josephine, merging 2 questions in one. How do you perceive the impact of battery storage and green hydrogen to the local Portuguese market?
Yeah, well, we've seen some kind of interesting developments here. I think battery storage is the most closest, in time, in terms of technology development. I know that there are companies that are looking also closer to do, to work on green hydrogen in the market. We're still evaluating really the business case there and the timeline and when we can see that being scaled up. So if you look for storage, I mean, just the fact that have storage as part of the auction is very interesting, but we're still wondering if it's really how big traction it's going to get in this auction, because of the expected price levels that we could see in the auction, the prices that we had last year. So it will depend on if someone is very daring to try to push a case for storage and bid with very low prices. And so really at the moment we don't see that much profitable business for energy storage just right now, but with the development of the Portuguese grid, I think storage is going to be an important part of that development if you're going to reach that 9 gigawatt target.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Josephine. I'll ask you one more question. Like, sorry, everybody, like there's a number of questions which will not be answered, but feel free to get either to me or to Josephine. Again, you should see like our emails here. So last question for the day. The latest tenders have been really focusing on the south of Portugal. Do you think the central and northern regions will be included in the next tenders, or what's your view on that?
I mean, we've seen this focus on the south, and I think that's also where we focused a lot of the analysis that we've done. In one of the major issues in Portugal has been the land access, and then trying to combine, getting the best value for the solar power. It will still make sense to have it in the south, but I think it will depend really what we will see now with the 700 megawatt, how much they fill up the connection points and how much more availability there will be in the grid in the southern regions. Because one of the issues is also to build solar where there are more solar resources, but of course the grid has to be in place.
Indeed, no, it makes sense. And so hopefully then still like some quite big potential development in other regions in Portugal. But with that said, so we're slightly over the limit of 4 o'clock. So Josephine, I just wanted to thank you very much for like all the time you spent assembling all that with you and your team. Thanks for all these like nice explanation on like the perspective of local market. Thanks to all of you in the audience for having taken the time to attend today. And keep in mind, yes, this webinar was part of the promotional campaign of our forthcoming event, which will take place in Lisbon on September 15th. You can still register up to tomorrow evening for the early bird price. So I would really urge you, if you're interested to attend, to just register now, get your logo on our website, and benefit from a lower price. And again, you've seen in the slide before the email addresses for Josephine and myself. We'll also send you the webinar slides at the latest by Monday afternoon. And with this said, thanks again for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we're really looking forward to a nice event in Portugal on September 15th and to meet you there. Thank you. Bye-bye.